Let's talk about
politics, environmental science,
global warming,
constitutional rights,
social and economic challenges,
money, power, choice.
Nature does not compromise.
extreme droughts, extreme heat waves.
sea levels are rising, and it is
About climate change.
This is the future of the next generations.
So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Manushi. I co-lead the environmental justice team at Change the Chamber. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So, and I'm your moderator for today. So this webinar is brought to you by Change the Chamber in collaboration with the Climate Week and Climate Action Campaign. Change the Chamber is a nonpartisan coalition of young adults. We have 100+ student groups across the country and internationally that focus on science-based climate action within the chambers of Congress, trade associations, corporations, government agencies, and local communities. So the first question is, and with that, I'll get started. Next slide, please. So why are we here? We're here because we know that extreme heat is one of the deadliest climate risks. It's already reshaping how people work, live, and stay safe, and it costs us money. The US economy, for instance, is losing approximately 100 billion annually in labor productivity losses. But the good news is we have problems, but we also have solutions, and we are here to radically amplify these solutions. And so we have an amazing panel for you who will explore different angles of this risk. We'll move through in three parts. First, we understand what the problem is, then we diagnose the gaps, and finally, we explore solutions. And after our speakers, we'll open up the floor for a discussion. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. With that, it is my pleasure to welcome Ashley. Ashley is the Director of Programs at the Climate Law Accelerator and the Supervising Attorney at Earth Rights Research and Action Clinic at NYU School of Law. Yes. And Ashley brings expertise at the intersection of climate litigation, legal intervention, and human rights. So over to Ashley.
Thanks so much. It's great to share space with this esteemed panel, and thank you to the entire Change the Chamber team for putting together this meaningful and timely discussion on extreme heat in the workplace. As Manushi noted, my name is Ashley Nemeth. I'm Director of Programs at the NYU Climate Law Accelerator and an Adjunct Professor of Clinical Law at the Terra Clinic. I've been asked to start us off with the context. Extreme heat from the lens of my work, which is focused on climate change and human rights. And my work is admittedly much broader than just extreme heat in the workplace and has a wider aperture geographically than the US, but I appreciate Change the Chamber's interest in setting the stage of this panel with a wider frame. And so I'm gonna provide insights into extreme heat impacts in the workplace, and also insights into impacts from one of America's colonies, from Puerto Rico, and the movement that exists at the federal level as a matter of regulatory practice. So let's go ahead and dive in. And next slide, please. You know, it's hot. We all know it. Our bodies feel it. Across the globe, anthropogenic climate change is resulting in increased extreme heat, rising temperatures, and more frequent heat waves. 2023 was the hottest year on record, and it was quickly beat the very next year in 2024. The World Weather Attribution Group and the Climate Central found that in 2024, an estimated 4 billion people, roughly half of the world's population, experienced an additional month of extreme heat due to climate change, with the average person globally enduring 41 extra days of dangerous heat. Next slide. And what we're seeing with heat is that it is straining the limits of human survivability in numerous countries across the world, including the US. Heat waves are the deadliest type of extreme weather event, with hundreds of thousands of people dying from heat-related causes each year. And I want to say that one more time. Heat waves are the deadliest type of extreme weather event, more deadly than hurricanes, than typhoons, and tornadoes, and the things that captivate the mind and news waves when extreme weather events happen. Prolonged heat exposure can exacerbate underlying illnesses from kidney disease to cardiovascular disease. It increases the risk of accidents and transmission of infectious diseases. And in extreme cases, it can cause critical illness, brain injuries, and death. Next slide. And this headline that you see on the next slide I think is perfect because it captures how heat does not get the attention that it deserves from policymakers and constituents alike, which is why I think this panel is so important. Many extreme weather events have names, like what we saw recently in the Caribbean in the United States with Hurricane Beryl, but we don't uniformly name heat waves. We don't have uniform categories for their intensity, nor are there uniform warning systems in place. And most importantly, we don't have a social culture of treating heat like the danger to life and livelihood that it is. And of course, there's varying reasons for this, right? Heat is silent and it's an invisible killer, and it's highly contextual. 100 degrees in Arizona is not the same as 100 in Norway. But I think most importantly, it fails to generate the kind of spectacular imagery and property damage that lands weather on primetime television and catalyzes government disaster responses, until very recently, as we'll hear from other panelists, to how cities and states are reacting. Next slide. And so the threat that extreme heat poses is especially relevant for the workplace because of how we rely on our bodies for labor. It's as simple as that. The screenshot here is a great piece by Isha Tandon at Carbon Brief. I love this outlet. They put out wonderful information on climate change. And it's covering a report from the Lancet Countdown on health and climate change that found that a record 512 billion work hours were lost around the world in 2023 because of risk exposure to heat. Extreme heat has been the focus of my work from the perspective of climate litigation and human rights advocacy. And I saw this firsthand working in Bangladesh, hearing from rickshaw drivers experiencing heat stroke while working and seeing colleagues and friends faint and eventually pass away because of the confluence of manual labor, rising temperatures, and for some, fasting during Ramadan. And so while the US is different in its workforce in terms of risk exposure when compared to a country like Bangladesh, it's still an immensely serious threat here at home. And as noted in the event program, as Manishi highlighted, the United States loses approximately $100 billion annually due to heat-induced labor productivity. And it's expected to double by 2030, which is right around the corner, and quintuple by 2050. Next slide, please. This is a great study by a frequent partner of ours at CLX, the Union of Concerned Scientists. It was published back in 2021, and it presents a series of interactive maps that offer an analysis quantifying the health and economic impacts of extreme heat. And so while all sorts of jobs require, different degrees of outside work, there's 7 categories, as you see on the screen, where it is extremely predominant, ranging from construction to transportation. And in the map that you see there, it shows the percent of each county's workforce that currently works outdoors. And so you can see where risk exposure is located. And most importantly, in this mosaic of different colors, you see that it's effectively all over the US. We have workers that are deeply exposed. Next slide. And so this leads us into the OSHA rule that has been proposed at the federal level. OSHA proposed this rule in August of last year. It closed the notice comment period earlier this year in January, and there were really robust hearings over the summer, which we took part in. And the proposed rule is close to 400 pages. It's very detailed and varied. I'm by no means an expert in all of the intricacies of the rule, but over 45,000 comments were submitted to the agency, and dozens of groups participated in the hearings that took place over 2 weeks. Next slide. And so we can get into the particulars of the rule later if needed. We're going to drop something in the chat with it, which is an OSHA fact sheet, which provides a really helpful overview of what the proposed rule would be. But I want to focus as a result of this OSHA process on the insight that it gave us at CLX from the experience of the American territories. Next slide. So as I noted, over 40,000 comments, only one came in substantively from Puerto Rico. And that was from a public school teacher talking about the impact of extreme heat in public schools. And this allowed us to recognize a critical gap that was missing in the advocacy process, which led us to reach out to the public school teachers union in Puerto Rico to make sure that they were part of the hearings on this process, because OSHA rules will apply in all of the US's territories. Next slide, please. And so I highlight this because when we think of extreme heat in the workplace, we are often and understandably thinking about outdoor workers, construction, agriculture, and the like, because of their significant vulnerability to rising temperatures. But we must also think of indoor workers and those that are exposed, like public school teachers who face not only rising temperatures with a lack of sufficient ACs, but also an energy crisis that fails to power even the systems that are in place to help them, survive in their workplaces. And so I want to end on the next slide, given our time, which is setting additional context. The federal rule is pending, and it is to be seen whether it will be promulgated in the current form that it exists, if it'll go even further, or if it'll be cut back. Clearly, there is appetite by the administration to continue with this rule because they could have gotten rid of it had they wanted to. But there's still space at the federal, state, and city level to provide increased worker protection. And we're lucky today to have Lee Count on the panel to shed light into what that effort looked like at the local level in Florida. But I love this graphic because it shows, understandably, how states with more outdoor workers are more worried about extreme heat. But importantly, it also shows the states that have blocked or passed those efforts, right? And so we see states like Texas, who have significantly large populations and a really high percent of adult workers being worried about extreme heat. And yet, Texas has blocked efforts for heat protections for outdoor workers, and the same is true of Florida. But there's still hope. Clearly, you see on the map, there are other bubbles there too. States like California, Nevada, Colorado, Maryland, Washington have passed their own protections, and we'll hear from the city of Boston how local cities are passing ordinances to do the same. And so there is room for advocacy at the federal, at the state, and at the local level to better protect workers in the face of rising temperatures. So thanks so much. I'm really excited to be part of this discussion. On the next slide is my email in case anyone's interested in nerding out over extreme heat, which has been my life recently. So thank you, Manushi and the team, and over back to you.
Thank you, Ashley. That was so important to set this context that heat is the deadliest form of weather event, and we don't have proper verbiage to address it. So, and also that it is silent and very, very contextual. Like you said, like 100 degrees in the Amazon is very different from 100 degrees in Norway. And everybody, essentially everybody, workers, anybody who works is at risk, and heat being such a threat multiplier. I think I'm very excited how this conversation is evolving, and I want to now introduce our next panelist, Dr. Kaylee Ward. She's a postdoctoral research associate in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the Northeastern University. Her research looks closely at how climate change and extreme heat intersect with social vulnerability and public health. So with that, over to Kaylee.
Thank you so much, Manushi. I'm going to be spending our time here talking about how heat trends are emerging in the United States, and then give us a bit of context around the current political climate and attacks on data that's important for us in monitoring heat waves and then mitigating the impacts of heat waves. So we'll go ahead onto the next slide here. So you likely have mentioned to a friend or family member recently how hot summers have gotten compared to your childhood, how we didn't have 80 or 90-degree days in October in many parts of the country. These trends of rising heat in the US are something that we will continue to have to manage as the effects of climate change worsen. So just to give us a snapshot on this, for example, in just the past 30 days, over 9 million Americans were under an extreme heat advisory from the National Weather Service, and that is oppressive heat, heat that does not alleviate at night, especially for those who do not have access to proper hydration or cooling and these sorts of things. We also see that this past year, Alaska had their first ever heat advisory in July. And in fact, out of all the US states and territories, Alaska is warming twice as fast as the global average. We also see that across all US states, we are suffering from rising heat. Compared to the 1960s, where we had about 2 heat waves a year in US cities, we now have on average about 6 heat waves a year. And these heat waves are also longer in duration, about a day longer in duration. So now we're having heat waves that aren't just a day or two, these are heat waves that are 3 or 4 days. And that additional day is extremely deadly. The longer the heat is, the more likely we are to see an uptick in heat-related illnesses and death. These trends in rising heat are a threat to public health and safety, especially if we already have issues in the US of undercounting and underestimating heat-related illnesses and death. So for those of you familiar with the Chicago 1995 heat wave, you will know that there were more than 700 people who perished during that heat wave, but that death toll is also sorely underestimated due to how we document cause of death when it comes to heat exposure. So as we go into a warmer future in the US, we have to ask ourselves, how hot can we take it? Who will be taking on that heat? And are we prepared to mitigate the threats of rising heat? Next slide. and then just tap to bring up the map. Perfect. So right now we're at about 1.7 degrees Celsius of warming, or about 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Right here on the map, you'll see an infographic from the National Climate Assessment. And this is essentially what we will see in the United States under that level of warming. So these are the number of days over 95 degrees in the United States. And this is sort of a moderate level of warming. We do see sort of that Texas effect that Ashley was mentioning, that Texas has declined having heat protections, but we know Texas will be greatly impacted by these things. But we are surpassing this. So if we look at a 3C increase, we are on track for globally an increase of about 2.7 degrees Celsius. That's about 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you click the next map to pop up, perfect. If we consider what 3C might look like, this is what it might look like. We are suddenly faced with a much more serious outlook where all counties in the US will be managing more heat waves more frequently. So these are the number of days over 95 degrees Fahrenheit again. And all of the deep red or mostly red are where they have 60 days or more of 95 plus degree weather. And suddenly this is not just sort of a Texas issue or a Florida problem or a California issue. We see that emergence across the Midwest, along the West Coast and East Coast. And these are changes that will happen rapidly within the next, 2 decades or so. By 2050, we're looking at severe consequences for, as Ashley mentioned, not just outdoor workers, but indoor workers as well. You'll also notice that on this map, this is covering most of the agricultural sectors in the United States as well. So we're likely to see an increase in heat-related illnesses and death, especially in these dark red counties. Next slide, please. So currently, at the federal level, multiple agencies provide critical information, not only on the effects of climate change with rising heat, but how this translates to health impacts. And here I've listed a number of different trackers and data dashboards and things like that. Each of these come from different groups. We have the CDC, the NWS, FEMA, NHTSA, and others like the EPA, which provide important information for both local EMS, but public health professionals and also local governments in how they are going to respond to coming heat waves. A lot of these trackers provide sort of a 7-day outlook, and so it gives us time to sort of proactively respond to coming heat waves. These trackers are also very important for mitigation tools, or thinking about which mitigation tools we might use. So these include things like, are we going to have designated cool zones? And often these are things like libraries or other public spaces that vulnerable groups can go to. It would also inform things like, is a city or county going to have restrictions on outdoor activities or things like work and construction and so on? This also allows time for the public to get access to water, for example, if they don't have access to water in the home, or they don't have running water, for example, or easily accessible water. However, we are in an unprecedented time where federal climate data and health data is under cuts and suppression. So for example, this year there were deep cuts proposed for NOAA, including eliminating major climate research programs, important reports, and other information. And of the agencies I mentioned, many of them rely on data from their sister organizations to do the work that they do. So for example, here, the NWS and CDC use the same data. They just produce a different portal that has a different focus. One is weather focused and one is more health focused and has materials for health professionals, for example. So when we are axing monitoring capabilities of one agency, we are actually placing more strain on other agencies and placing people at risk. There are efforts to preserve this data by multiple groups across the United States, where organizations are reproducing trackers and monitoring programs that were removed from federal websites. I've been participating in those sorts of processes as well. In other cases, organizations are devoting all of their time to preserving data sets, such as the Public Environmental Data Partners, which is covering data from things like the CDC to NOAA to the EPA and others, so that groups, state level, local level, have access to this data that's really important for informing public health and protecting public health. These types of preservation efforts are extremely important, and we're likely to see them ramp up as we go into the next year. But we are also seeing states respond to this issue of if we can't manage something, if we don't measure it. So, for example, you may have seen in the news that West and East Coast states have created their own sort of health coalitions just this past week. So we have the West Coast Health Alliance, which includes California, Oregon, and Washington. And we have the Northeast Public Health Collaborative, which includes a whole host of Northeastern states, but New York, Vermont, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Delaware, Maine, and Maryland. I don't think I forgot anybody there. But these sorts of groups are really important because when we lose that sort of federal support, these states can rely on each other and provide that assistance that they're not getting from the federal level. So we're going to see more activation of like mid-level governance and more activation at the local level as these supports sort of fall away at the federal level. And then as I close this section of the presentation, I want us to remember that when heat risk is rising, but we're losing data sets, we're losing monitoring programs, and disclosure rules are being weakened, those of us responsible for upholding public health lose many of the tools that allow us to prepare for heat and to protect the most vulnerable, especially workers who are outside. And just to the question that's in the chat, Virginia is not included in that coalition. And then as we'll be living in a much warmer US, the question we have to ask ourselves is not if people will die of heat, but it is rather how many and how often. That is sort of the scenario that we are in. And in this context, it becomes very important that local governments have robust heat protocols and regulations to protect those most vulnerable to excessive heat exposure. And we'll hear a little bit about that from Boston in particular on how we're going to really manage this heat threat going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaylee. That was an excellent summary of, the nature of the beast. What are we dealing with, and how much information do we have to tackle this problem? I don't want to take a lot of time, so I'm going to bring in Jody next, who's going to tell us how City of Boston is navigating this complicated sort of, dynamic with the federal government and actually passing an ordinance in 6 months, I think, on protecting its workers from extreme heat. So without further ado, I pass the mic to Jody.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you for the presentations beforehand. My name is Jody Sugarman-Brozan. I have the honor of serving as the Deputy Chief of Worker Empowerment for Mayor Michelle Wu in the City of Boston, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our heat protection approach and climate resilience efforts. So if you can go to the next slide. And the next one. Thank you. So the Worker Empowerment Cabinet was created by Mayor Wu shortly into her administration, and it was to bring all of the efforts around worker protections and workforce development under one umbrella. And when that was created, we created an office called the Office of Labor Compliance and Worker Protections, which is our labor department within the city. We are part of a cabinet that also works on pathways to good quality family sustaining jobs, workforce development, as well as pathways to youth employment. We hire about 10,000 young people every summer in jobs that are opportunities to explore careers. And we had this summer for the first time something we called the Boston Youth Climate Corps, where we brought together about 200 young people working in nonprofits focused on climate related work to explore careers in that area. If you can go to the next slide. So our next slide, sorry. There we go. Oh no, I'm sorry. The office one up from there. So sorry. Slide 24, I think. I'll say a little bit, hopefully we can get back to that one. Our office, the Office of Labor Compliance, there we go. The Office of Labor Compliance and Worker Protections enforces all of the city's laws around labor protections. Many of these are focused on wage and hiring goals, and they're listed here. I won't go into detail, but we were tasked very early on in looking at issues related to some high-profile worker fatalities in construction. So one of the first things that our office did was work with developers and other contractors, advocates to look at what was happening and see if we as the city could utilize the powers that we have to drive fair and not just fair labor standards, but also safer conditions. And I'm talking about, if you can go to the next slide, with that, we were able to pass a new ordinance called the Safe Construction and Demolition Ordinance. And I'm talking about this ordinance because it directly relates and provided a model for our heat protection ordinance, which I'll get to in just a couple of minutes. Essentially, the city of Boston, we cannot regulate worker protections that are regulated at the state or federal level. However, we can use the power of our contracting and permitting. And what we did with the Safe Construction and Demolition Ordinance is required that anybody who is seeking a permit to do construction create a site safety plan, ensure that workers were trained on that site safety plan in a language that they understand, and ensure that if a project was large enough, over 50,000 square feet or larger than 4 stories, that a full-time site safety coordinator was on site at all times with at least 30 hours of safety training. We did a lot of work on this ordinance to roll it out, ensure that we were providing resources to contractors. And if you go to the next slide, we created a new website. We provided free OSHA 10 and OSHA 30 classes and a number of site webinars on different health and safety issues. And extreme heat was one of those and has been an issue since we started working on construction safety. And if you go to the next slide, the city of Boston, we work across departments regularly. So looking at issues of extreme heat, while we were approaching it from the workers' rights, workers' safety side, our Office of Climate Resilience is tasked with looking at and ensuring that they are implementing climate resilience projects across the city, not just on extreme heat, but coastal flooding and stormwater flooding. So the Office of Climate Resilience, if you go to the next slide, had already started creating and had already released a plan to address the rising temperatures in the city of Boston. In that plan was specifically a section with recommendations around worker protections, and those are on the next slide. Or that it included all different aspects, including what to do during heat waves, what kind of efforts we could put in place, and including also, of course, workers. That's on the next slide. And the recommendations for workers were pretty straightforward, exploring opportunities for developing local guidelines, sharing resources, providing employers with best practices, and engaging around advocacy around state level policy. We began implementing and working on these strategies as early as 2023 and 2024. If you can go to the next slide. Oops, I think there's one more before that. Or maybe not, I'm sorry. Yes, slide 30. No, one more, I'm so sorry. Yes, slide 30 is, I'll stay there for just a minute. I wanted to bring in also that while we work on these issues and are developing plans, it is the Boston Public Health Commission that works very closely on overall citywide protection. So if you go to the slide just before this one, the city of Boston, like many cities, have thresholds. Those thresholds are when and how to declare a heat advisory and a heat emergency, and then working together with the Office of Climate Resilience and other offices across the city, there are certain measures that are put in place when temperatures rise. If you could go to that next slide. This is the process that's used. And finally, the slide after that is how the different actions that are taken based on the level of heat exposure. And so the city has a whole set of strategies around heat protections. We began working directly on those strategies for workers, and to combine with that, if you go to the next slide, as early as 22 and 24, we started utilizing the resources we had at hand to work directly with employers. So our inspectional services department has over 28,000 permitted contractors. We use that to get information out about how to keep workers safe during excessive heat. We send training materials. We send OSHA and NIOSH tools. We then created very, very well-attended webinars for workers and their employers, and we provided training internally to our own City of Boston departments. That is when we began exploring, especially as we were beginning to look at the timeline for the OSHA ordinance and timeline for state protections, our own citywide ordinance. And our city councilor, Ben Weber, worked very closely with our team, if you go to the next slide, to pass an ordinance just this past August. The ordinance was signed and will go into effect, signed by the mayor, and will go into effect of March of 2026. And we're very excited about it. What makes me most excited about the ordinance is that it not only puts protections in place for our for workers working in the City of Boston on City of Boston contracts, but it makes the City of Boston a model employer. And if you go to the next slide, it will require that all City of Boston workers that are exposed to excessive heat have a job-specific heat illness prevention plan in place, and will receive training on the plan as well as training on how to understand signs and symptoms of heat stress and other important trainers. It will also require that certain contractors, including construction contractors, attest that they have a heat illness prevention plan in place as well. And we will provide templates and training. We will not be able as a city to review all of those plans, but we will make sure that they have resources in place that those plans are that they can create those plans. Our office will be responsible for implementation and monitoring, and as part of that, every construction or any covered project will have a poster explaining to workers what protections they should be receiving and ensuring that they reach out to our office and our team if they have not received training or support around a job-specific heat illness prevention plan. And I have just a few more slides on and this will all be in place for summer of 2026. So we will be working through the winter to identify which City of Boston workers will be covered, create their plans, identify which contractors will be covered, ensure that they have resources. And we know that about 3,500 workers in Boston work on City of Boston covered contracts every year. So it'll have a pretty wide impact, even though it will not be able to cover workers who aren't directly on contracts with the City of Boston, it will still have a significant impact. And if you could go to the next slide. Quickly, a little bit about what's included. We know that for workers, understanding signs and symptoms are really important because you can go from heat exhaustion to heat stroke very quickly. So training and all heat illness prevention plans will ensure that workers receive this training. And the next slide. And we will use best practices when it comes to occupational safety and health, meaning the hierarchy of controls. For folks who are here on this call and involved in occupational health and safety, know that NIOSH, OSHA utilizes these to ensure that we are making site-specific, job-specific plans that work best for the workers in those jobs, and will use engineering, administrative, and PPE as part of the program. And then on the last two slides, if you can go to the next two slides, obviously rest, water, and shade is an important piece. All plans will have to ensure how they're providing rest, water, and shade. And finally, heat illness prevention plans. We will provide a template, and it will include all the things that most people know about: providing water, access to shade, work and rest schedules, a buddy system. But one of the things that is really important that we're going to make sure is part of all of these templates and plans is opportunities to acclimate to a job. Workers are most often injured and die on the job within their first couple of days because they are not yet used to the extreme heat. We also want to make sure that there is emergency response procedures in place and training. And then the last slide talks a little bit about who will be trained. as well as what they will be trained on. And that is all for City of Boston. I'm happy to answer questions, and I'm very thankful to be part of this webinar today. We are very, very excited to lead this work nationally and to ensure that our workers, in particular in Boston, is a model employer as we move forward.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jody. That was such a beautiful summary. That yes, we have problems, but then we have to be creative about how we think of solutions, especially now. Just I do want to highlight that it's really it was interesting for me to see how City of Boston is mobilizing a systems response and like creating this conducive space for actions and solutions, even though your immediate plan is for contractual workers, but it will definitely have an impact on that entire ecosystem. So thank you for that. I'm very excited to present the next speaker, Oscar, who is the co-executive director of WeCount, and he is going to present more alongside on the lines of how immigrant workers and outdoor workers in South Florida experience extreme heat and how they're advocating for stronger protections. So over to Oscar.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with all of you. As Manushi said, my name is Oscar Londoño. I'm the co-executive director of WeCount, and I'm based here in Homestead, Florida, where hundreds of workers have been leading a fight called Que Calor to try to win heat protections for hundreds of thousands of workers in South Florida and across the state. And I want to begin actually by showing you all a video and introducing you to a worker named Araceli. As you'll see, Araceli is a plant nursery worker. She's a mother of two. She's an immigrant from Mexico, and she's one of the hundreds of worker leaders who are really behind WeCount, trying to win protections to save her life and the life of other workers as we see harsher and harsher temperatures every single year. And I think before I show this video, I just want to say that, you know, behind the data and the headlines and the science, it's all really important. I think we should never forget that there are actual human beings who are living and working under these conditions every single day, being denied water, shade, and rest, which are human rights, but that they're also not just victims. They're actually leaders. They're the ones finding solutions. They're experts in their workplaces. So I'm so happy to introduce you to Araceli, and later on I'll share a little bit more about Planting Justice, our new initiative. And you see the audio isn't working.
A todo consumidor que piense un momento que esa planta hermosa que tienen en su jardín, ¿en manos de qué pasaron? Pudo haber sido en una persona que trabajó enferma, una persona que está trabajando pero día a día sufre de acoso, una persona que es explotada para llegar a las cantidades de producción que tiene que dar. A mí me gusta mi trabajo. En la mata que trabajo, o sea, me emociona porque eso es creatividad para mí. Yo uso mi creatividad en esa mata. Yo soy detallista en mi mata, en mi planta que mando a la venta. Yo soy de las que perfecciono mi trabajo. A mí me gusta que vaya bien. Entonces, para mí es una emoción ver que mi trabajo vaya hermoso, que vaya de primera calidad. Yo siempre decía, es calidad la mata. O sea, vayan a lo mejor. Mi nombre es Araceli Lucho Escobar. Soy mexicana. Emigré hace 21 años. Emigré por la razón de la pobreza. Soy hija mayor, por lo tanto me vi con la necesidad de ayudar a mis padres y por esa razón fue que me vine aquí a Estados Unidos. Yo por 14 años he sido podadora. Podamos, más tenemos una tarea de cuánto vamos a producir al día. La producción proviene de 40, 45 matas por hora. Muchas compañeras terminamos la producción, muchas no. El mes de agosto, como le digo, la mata que trabajo es un proceso, que el mes de agosto el campo queda limpio, empieza la mata de nuevo. Por lo regular, nuestro trabajo físicamente es ir agachado, nuestra cara hacia el suelo. La lona del sol, eso es algo caliente. Y son días, semanas enteras completos trabajar así porque no hay otra cosa que hacer. Un 8 de agosto yo entré, yo me sentía mal con dolor de cabeza. Yo no le miraba final a 2 horas de trabajo. La calor, yo sentía la desesperación, yo sentía que iba a caer. No terminé el trabajo, yo recuerdo bien que de lo mal que me sentía, si hice 30 matas en 2 horas y media, era poco, porque yo sentía que no podía más. Me dio una parálisis facial ahí. No avisé a nadie, solamente a la hora de la comida agarré y le dije a mi compañera, dame unas pastillas porque no aguanto el dolor de cabeza. Ella misma agarró y me ayudó a quitarme todo lo que usamos para trabajar, sombrero, pañuelos, porque nos cubrimos nosotros para el sol. Y me estaba dando las pastillas y me dijo, tú no estás bien, tu cara se te fue de lado, la boca está de lado, me dijo ella. Y yo me quedé, o sea, en shock. Me quedé y se me rodaron las lágrimas ese día. Le llamé al supervisor, le dije, oye, mira, yo me siento, estoy mal, ¿qué tienes? Le dije, me dio una parálisis en la cara. Me dijo, ¿estás bien para que manejes a casa? Yo le dije, sí. Nunca me dijeron, te vamos a llevar a enfermería o te vamos a llevar a una clínica, porque sé que la compañía tenía su clínica, más no me ofrecieron nada de eso. Me fui al hospital. Luego dijo el doctor, tienes que tener reposo para que puedas recuperarte más pronto. Ok, y agarré, le llamé al supervisor, no voy a trabajar. Agárrate el tiempo necesario, pero yo creo que yo soy madre soltera, no puedo decir, voy a disponer de una semana en casa. Tuve que regresar enferma a trabajar. Al llegar al trabajo, y ya me dijo la supervisora, ¿estás bien? Sí, ok, vas a trabajar. El hecho de que tú estás enferma, vete, trabaja y da la producción igual que tus compañeras, porque si te presentas a trabajar es porque tú estás bien, pero pues uno no está bien. Yo me cubro con la cara, claro, a mí me daba vergüenza ir con mis compañeras, la cara destapada, con la cara de lado. Yo sobreviví a lo que viví, más mucha gente tal vez ahí mismo quede, colapsan y ya no se levantan. Los trabajadores pasamos por mucho. Para mí, un cambio sería que tuviéramos un contrato por escrito que nos diga todos nuestros derechos que tenemos como trabajador. Otro, los trabajadores viven mucho el acoso sexual, un alto al acoso sexual, alto a la explotación, que tengamos días de vacaciones pagadas, tanto como vacaciones como también por enfermedad, porque uno se enferma, se ve a casa, mas no hay sueldo. Que me respetaran como ser humano que soy, que no me vean como un simple trabajador. Soy un humano, lo cual tengo también derechos. Todos los trabajadores de la Florida nos estamos organizando con el proyecto Sembrando Justicia para poder lograr un contrato con los compradores y así se haga valer nuestro derecho como los trabajadores de tercería que somos.
Thank you. I know it lagged a little bit, but I can share it afterwards. But I just want to say that, as Ashley mentioned, back in 2021, we led a campaign called Que Calor, which translates into how hot, to try to win a local heat standard in Miami-Dade. And unfortunately, in 2024, that local ordinance was preempted by our Florida legislature and governor, who enacted HB 433. Similar to Texas, what that law did is it made it illegal for cities, counties, local governments across the state to enact enforceable local heat standards, with the exception of cases in which you're dealing with city or county contracted employees. And so this is where planting justice comes in. In a moment in which workers in Florida, but frankly across the U.S. South, are having a hard time finding government solutions to try to protect their lives, to try to enact enforceable workplace heat standards. Our project called Planting Justice is trying to find another way forward. If you buy a house plant, if you tend to a garden, it's really workers like Araceli who are sustaining this multi-billion-dollar industry. And many of us, especially during COVID, began buying plants in our homes, in our offices, in our gardens. Many of us love our monstera, our snake plant, our pothos, but many of us don't ask ourselves the question of who actually made that plan possible. And what's interesting about Florida is that Florida is the national epicenter of the plant industry. The majority of the plants that we consume across the country are coming from workers like Araceli, who are having their workplace rights preempted by their own government. And so ultimately, planting justice is calling not just on workers, but on all of us as consumers, as allies, to try to use our power to enact a private sector solution. So in the face of government inaction, what can we do? What we're fighting for is enforceable brand agreements. There are large big box retail stores and grocery chains that are buying and selling plants from nurseries, but doing very little to ensure that their supply chain is clean of labor abuse and exploitation. Not just the denial of water, shade, and rest breaks, but guarantees around fair wages, safe working conditions, and an end to harassment, intimidation, and retaliation that workers tell us weekly they're experiencing across the industry. And so this program really comes after months and months of hundreds of workers being surveyed and workers creating what they call a code of conduct, a visionary platform of rights of what they want to see in their workplaces. That it shouldn't matter what nursery you work in, anywhere in the state or anywhere in the country, that these rights should be the minimum baseline rights that every worker is provided. And within that, of course, we continue to fight for a heat illness prevention standard, an enforceable set of rights that will decrease the incidence of heat-related illnesses and deaths in workplaces. And we think this intervention is necessary, one, because there's minimal action being taken at the federal level. We've been engaged in the advocacy around the national heat rule, but it's also worth saying at the same time as this rule may or may not go forward, there are less than 2,000 investigators at OSHA across the country. OSHA does not have the resources, the staffing, or the enforcement power to regulate the laws that they already have on the books. And so this government solution won't be enough to protect workers. We got to find private sector or additional complementary strategies to make sure that workers actually receive the protections that they need and deserve. Two, we saw this summer in places like Florida, agricultural workers who have died of heat stress and heat stroke. And so we're really calling on consumers, on businesses, on the private sector to try to lead, not to wait for government solutions that may or may not come, or simply rely on a couple of cities across the country enacting these protections. While that's valuable, the question still becomes, for the agricultural workers in the U.S. South, what's the solution? What's the solution when you don't have local, state, or federal action coming in at any time soon? And we know this program works. There are programs like the Fair Food Program that have eradicated these problems in places like the tomato fields of Florida that are expanding across the country, but also expanding across the world, right? There are workers in Chile, in South Africa, in Ecuador, in the UK, across the world who are experimenting with how do we make sure the companies at the top of the supply chain are also held accountable for making sure that the working conditions of the workers at the bottom of the supply chain are made real. And so if you want to learn more about planting justice, you can visit our site, we-count.org/plantingjustice. You can follow us on social media, where we have videos of workers like Araceli and others talking about the labor and human rights crisis in the nurseries. And then we also have a solidarity membership program. This fight cannot just be led by workers. Every single one of us should have a stake in the human rights conditions of the workers who make our products, our goods, and our services possible. And so if you want to become a solidarity member, you can join us at we-count.org/solidarity. But once again, the project's called Planting Justice. It just got launched, and I'm really excited for people across the country to join us.
Thank you, Oscar. And that ties so beautifully with the panel and the things that we've been discussing, that we have challenges, and extreme heat is inevitable and it's a threat multiplier, but it's people at the front lines who are most vulnerable. These are people who build our cities. These are people who make our cities beautiful, but they're also most at risk, and they're also driving this action. And thank you also for highlighting that why this needs to be a systems response. It's not a responsibility of a solo body or a solo person, but we need to be together to mobilize this. So with that, I think we can move to the question and answer section of the webinar. And in this section also, I want to bring out, like, maybe we can check the chat. And I want to sort of highlight more of the solutions then we have the problem. So there's a question for Oscar, and it says, is there anything like B Corp certifications for products that are sourced from sources free of abuse?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Ellen. I think part of the program is we're creating a worker-led certification program. So too many of us have heard of fair trade, all these kinds of corporate social responsibility programs, certifications that still have not eradicated labor and human rights abuses. And so part of what we're trying to move forward is a worker-led certification program where through these brand agreements with big box retail stores and grocery chains, it's workers themselves, workers that we're training through WeCount that can actually do the auditing, the monitoring, and the enforcement of standards, who actually have a real stake in making sure the problem is actually resolved, versus just trying to clean up the image or the brand of these large-scale corporations. And so I think part of joining Planting Justice is helping us define that code of conduct, helping us make sure that we put pressure on these large-scale corporations to do the right thing, and then be able to implement a worker-led certification program so that one day, which isn't currently the case, there are actually nurseries and corporations where we can buy, where we know those plants have been certified. Currently, that isn't the case.
I think it's very interesting, Oscar, how you're leading this, especially in a state that is just opposed to any human rights issues, and I find it so inspirational. Um, I just was curious, like, what are some of like, how have you been so creative in this journey and navigating this? Like, because I know that most people would just shut down, but I feel like VCount has been creatively navigating all of these hurdles. And I don't know if you have any message to share with others who are on similar, they're thinking they need to do something, but they're not sure because of all these administrative hurdles.
Yeah, I think creativity comes out of necessity, right? It's like when in 2018, we actually began advocating for a statewide heat standard in Florida to try to enact statewide legislation. And that legislation came because in the fall of 2017, one of our worker leaders, Jose Delgado, who cut sweet potato vine in Homestead in Florida City, collapsed and suffered heat stroke within minutes, got hospitalized within minutes of dying on the job. And so when you see the crisis escalating every single summer, when you see a lack of solutions being enacted, when every single week your center, your community center is fielding the calls, the messages, the visits, the walk-ins of people who are telling you, I'm being denied these basic human rights, you have no alternative but to try to find a strategy for it, right? Preemption won't stop us. If the government doesn't want to take action, where else can we go to try to win this? And I think this is where I'd encourage more people to learn about the worker-driven social responsibility model, which is called WSR, which is a strategy that isn't just applicable in agriculture, but in multiple consumer-facing industries in the United States, but also across the world. And it's one I think that we should begin to popularize as a path forward, especially in a moment when government regulations are being scaled back and public enforcement is being dismantled.
Thank you so much, Oscar. Thank you so much. I think I would like to bring it back to Kaylee and talk about how do we navigate this problem of lack of data? Like, what do we do about it?
It's a good question. I think for the past 9 months or so, we've all sort of been kind of floundering a little bit for those of us who rely on these sources of federal data, which I should state, is funded by, public, your tax dollars. We should have access to this regardless of the fact anyways. But one of the things that we have been doing, or one of the things that I advocate for, is citizen science, which is similar to what WeCount is doing, sort of that engaging the community, going out in the community, having the data come from them, having that flow into an organization, partnering across organizations, partnering with clinics, partnering with universities, and sort of scaffolding all of this so that we have that information available. Of course, that will become a more localized effort, which is less efficient than having, the grand infrastructure of a larger organization. But there are benefits to sort of these localized efforts because you have a much better sort of pulse point. You can take a temperature a lot easier, for lack of a better word, on what is going on in the community, what is an effective intervention for that community compared to another community or another state. Because one intervention in one state is going to be more effective than in another. For the same reasons that heat waves are contextual, interventions are also contextual. So I think advancing citizen science, having people affected by heat, documenting heat, whether that's, going visits to the ER, heat-related illnesses, things like that. Having that information is really important. There are still some efforts to preserve this at within universities and at state level. One of the trackers that I think is really useful, and I'll use Ashley's thing from earlier that we are nerds, is the EMS tracker I mentioned is a great resource. It's updated weekly, has state-to-state information, and that tracker focuses on heat-related incidents. And so it looks at per 100,000 people in the population, how many heat-related incidents were there. And that has unsurprisingly increased. So by about 5 or 6 counts between 2018 and now. So I think it was originally 10 or so to now 15 members of 100,000 people going in for heat-related events. So these things coupled together can really push us forward. What I say is the progress does not need to be perfect. Oftentimes we're like, it's not like the perfect model or the perfect ordinance or, we stop. But progress doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to be progress. And so things like what's happening in Boston, progress. It doesn't allow us, to manage the federal regulations or other things. But there are ways in which we can disrupt in a way that is meaningful and useful to protecting people on the ground, which I think We Count does really well, that Boston is doing really well, and that other efforts are doing very well.
Progress does not need to be perfect. Yes. Judy, let's move on to you. And with this process of institutionalizing a heat ordinance, I wonder if there are some learnings that you could quickly share.
Yeah, I think for us, it was trying to figure out as a municipality what leverage we did have and how we could utilize that leverage. And cities and towns don't have the power to regulate things at the same level as the federal government or a state, but we spend a lot of money and we can use the power of our procurement to drive fair and safe labor standards. And that's a theme for the city of Boston across all of our labor compliance efforts, whether it's around ensuring that we're not working with contractors that owe workers as a result of wage theft, or if we are ensuring that those contractors we hire don't have significant OSHA violations. All of these things are incorporated into our work. So I think it's finding where you have leverage, utilizing that leverage to the extent that you can. And the other piece I think that's really important is to be as collaborative as possible. We are now working on an implementation plan. We'll be engaging experts in the city of Boston, advocates and partners of ensuring that we're working on we're regulating the right contracts, that we're assisting workers in the city of Boston with heat illness prevention plans, all of those who might be affected by excessive heat. And that includes public school teachers. In Boston, we do not have air conditioning in many of our buildings. And that is a major issue and has continued to be a major issue. We're about to go through a process of upgrading many of our school buildings, and that will change. But in the meantime, what protections can we put in place? How can we support both indoor and outdoor City of Boston employees and ensuring that they are having the protections they need to do their jobs safely?
Thank you, Jody. Great insights. And I think I'll pull in Ashley. And I also want to put a reminder, like if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We're at 12:01. But Ashley, just very quickly, like from your litigation background, I was curious if you had any insights on this issue.
Yeah, I think, my litigation background is predominantly focused on climate, and the topic of climate litigation is often centered on questions of causation, proving that some specific climate impact is actually the source of the harm of the person and not something else, and proving that the person that you're suing is the actual person who should be liable for that harm because, anthropogenic climate change is a result of many emissions and numerous consumption. And I think in this sense, the focus on extreme heat is actually, for the first time or uncommonly in climate litigation, a place to be optimistic. The science connecting extreme heat to climate change is extremely robust. And so there's a wonderful opportunity in terms of capitalizing on this low-hanging fruit of scientific evidence, connecting causation within the concept of legal standards. And so extreme heat litigation is happening. It's happening at the regional level. There's a really famous case that came down at the European Court of Human Rights on behalf of senior Swiss ladies and the impact of extreme heat on elderly women. We're seeing it at the city and state level. There are cases, one in particular, Multnomah County in Oregon, where the county is suing fossil fuel companies for the impact of the North Pacific heat wave that happened a few years ago. And so extreme heat is presenting itself as an opening in litigation to start delivering on reparation and making communities whole and pushing governments to engage in adaptation planning and emissions reduction. And so while extreme heat is a significant threat, it is also a legal opportunity that litigators and advocates should be capitalizing on to deliver on greater protections for people in addition to workers. And so I hope, I know that we're over time, and so I'll just say we had talked about sort of a parting message that each of us could give. And mine would be that, the law can be very nuanced and technical, and it can feel like it excludes the people it is supposed to serve. But the work of Oscar and others demonstrate that really the law is sort of there for the taking, and it is up to all of us to engage with it and to push it to actually protect people. So thanks so much for this wonderful discussion.
Oscar, quick takeaway in few words.
I'm inspired, Jody, by the example in Boston, not just on heat, but so many different things. It's so much leadership being offered by Boston in this moment. And I think, wherever we can, we have to make advancements, as Kaylee said. And so I think whether it's to government, whether it's the private sector, whether it's domestic, whether it's global, finding more ways, because the crisis isn't going anywhere, but we need more people in the fight.
Kaylee, quick takeaway.
Yes, always get engaged. There is an organization somewhere where you are that is doing work on this. You just don't know they're there. So pay attention to them, join their newsletter, go to their events, and always remember that just because something is legal does not mean it's ethical or founded on morals or things like that. So it's very important that we're always pushing this wherever possible. And as long as you are engaged and not disengaged, we can do good things together. Remember, progress does not have to be perfect.
Love that. Jody, closing words.
I think I just echo what everybody has said. Collaboration, action doesn't have to be perfect. If you're taking step forwards and working together with stakeholders, you'll find some solutions. And we're hoping that City of Boston can be an example, and we'll hope to report back in a couple of months, or at least early next summer with real results.
Amazing. I think, yes, I want to thank you for the panel for coming together. I know Climate Week is so hectic, so thanks to every one of you. And I see the participants that have stayed with us, and even though we're like 6 minutes over time, so it just shows that, the appetite for action is growing. We have problems, but, we are also the makers of these solutions. So what we're going to do is follow up with you with resources that were shared in this chat. If you want to learn more, we also have a Changemaker training at Change the Chamber, where it's environmental advocacy 101. So how do you get involved? How do you incorporate evidence-based advocacy? And we'll also share that with you and follow up to this webinar, and we'll get your yes, thank you, Tony. Thank you for putting the Changemaker training in the chat. And yes, and we'll follow up with all these resources, and we're very excited. Please connect with us on LinkedIn or connect with us over email. We want to be in touch. We want to mobilize more action. And with that, I'll now keep quiet. Amazing.